At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, Jo Neal. Today we have an absolutely brilliant guest with us. We have an awful lot to discuss about psychedelic-assisted therapy, about psychiatry, about the use of ayahuasca, particularly in indigenous settings, indigenous practice, healing, Simon's non-for-profit organisation, Onaya Science. So since I've given it away already, I will tell you that guest is Dr. Simon Ruffell. So very warm welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Thank you so much, Jo. Really, really good to be here.
And actually, I think I should say welcome back to the podcast because you were interviewed by David Nutt, I think, in 2021.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, one of the early drug science episodes.
And that, casting my mind back, that was all about ayahuasca's use in the Amazon, I'm guessing.
It was, yeah. So that was going over our early studies a few years ago. So yeah, lots of updates for you here.
That's great, yeah, because that's 3 years ago. So an awful lot has happened and Simon has been incredibly busy. So just to sort of complete the introduction, Simon is a psychiatrist, so he practices Western medicine, but he also is very much involved in traditional plant medicine and indigenous practices as a student of Curanderismo. So I think for many people, that's quite extraordinary to have somebody who's managing so successfully to, combine the sort of Western practice, how we practice medicine here, and how, indigenous people use plant medicines for spiritual purposes and for healing. So for me, for many of us, I think that's particularly impressive and quite unusual. But I think when we're talking about psychedelic-assisted therapy, that's particularly important. So Simon is working to understand plants such as ayahuasca, and he'll tell us what ayahuasca is, from both an indigenous and a Western viewpoint, and how can we sort of bridge those two and kind of bring good practice into the West. Now, Simon's training in Shipibo shamanism, and he's been training for quite a long time. And I'm told that he's also learning the language. So at some point, I think we'll ask him to say something in Shipibo. So Simon, but obviously, how did you get to this point? That's kind of the obvious question, I think. And so I thought we'd just start at the beginning and talk about maybe where you grew up, why you decided to study medicine, and why psychiatry, because not so many people go into psychiatry.
Yeah, absolutely. So where did I grow up? I was thinking about this the other day, actually, and not questioning where I grew up, but the influence that has on the rest of my life. Yeah. And I grew up in Kent, which is just southeast of London in suburbia, in a town called Sevenoaks. And it's one of these places that's really great if you're under 6 or over 60. And then you have this big gap in the middle where it's really, really boring, at least in my experience. And I was just reflecting on the impact that must have had in my life in basically wanting to get out of there when I was younger. And so I remember coming to the realization that my band was never going to make it big like I was hoping that it would do. And then, which was a bit of a blow, I'm not going to lie. And then thinking, well, what could I do to try and help people that would allow me to travel?
Just Simon, is your band on YouTube anywhere or on Bandcamp, or is the band anywhere that people can find it?
I don't know if I'm going to regret saying this, but it was on MySpace. If anybody remembers MySpace.
Hello there, Drug Science Podcast listeners. This is James Bunn, the producer of the Drug Science Podcast. And we wouldn't be the evidence-based, scientifically backed organization that we are without doing our fair share of research. So without further ado, I'm going to sprinkle a couple of Simon's banned audios throughout this episode. So enjoy.
I thought I knew you from the outside, but when I looked inside, I saw you
lied. And the band's name... The band's name was Genova. And you can find me with a rather impressive emo haircut with a very long fringe dyed black.
That's great.
But anyway, this is digressing. I didn't think this is the way that this podcast was going to go. But anyway, when Genova never made it big, I decided that probably the best way that I could spend my time would be to study medicine, which would allow me to help people and also to travel at the same time, which is something that I really wanted to do. And much to my surprise, I got into med school and was always really fascinated with the human mind. And I always wanted to do psychiatry. That was my primary focus. I was really interested specifically with the psychosis. What happens when the brain, quote unquote, goes wrong? What is that? And do we fully understand that? And I was fortunate throughout med school to be able to travel a lot. And I worked in various psychiatric hospitals and various psychiatric wards across the world. And I had my first experience with traditional healers actually when I was working in Uganda, working in a psychiatric hospital in northern Uganda, or rather a ward. It was the only psychiatric ward in the whole of northern Uganda, working with traditional healers there to treat people who used to be child soldiers, mainly. It was an area that was full of child soldiers. And so that was my first contact with traditional healers. But like many psychiatrists, and I'm not alone when I say this, I was getting increasingly dismayed by the lack of treatments that we had that seemed to be effective, specifically pharmacological treatments. And so I started looking for, to be honest, I don't really know what I was looking for. I was looking for something else.
Can I ask you what aspect of the pharmacological treatments then was so kind of disappointing? Was it all the side effects or the lack of them actually making people better?
The side effects for sure. But for me personally, it was seeing people come back so frequently and so regularly. And so I'd be working on psychiatric wards and we do all of this work with patients in order to discharge them. And I began to expect to see them in a few months. And this isn't just the hospitals that I was working in. That happens so frequently that in psychiatry, there's actually a term that's given to that. And it's called the revolving door syndrome because we see people so often. So that was really what was beginning to get me down. And I'm not against pharmacological treatments, like not at all. I think there's absolutely a role for pharmacological treatments. And I'm not anti-psychiatry. I think psychiatry does a great job for some people. But there's also a significant population, a significant portion that feel let down by modern day psychiatry. And that's why there's such a big push to research new ways of treating mental health conditions. So I found myself in Guatemala, and by a stroke of fate, I found myself sitting next to a curandero, a shaman, who was working in Peru, who was actually on holiday. So it turns out that shamans have to go on holiday as well. Yeah. And we started talking, and he told me all about the work that he was doing, which was working with traditional Peruvian medicine, and specifically a psychedelic medicine called ayahuasca.
Ah, and had you heard of ayahuasca before?
I had heard of it. I was intrigued. I wanted to try it, but I didn't really know that much about it. But I did know that it was a psychedelic that was used throughout the Amazon rainforest, and that it contained the extremely potent psychedelic dimethyltryptamine, DMT, and that it was combined with monoamine oxidase inhibitors. And this largely activates the DMT. It does other stuff as well. Monoamine oxidase inhibitors are actually quite an old school antidepressant, so it could have some antidepressant effects as well. And so this shaman, this curandero, started telling me about the amazing results that he was getting with his patients, treating them with ayahuasca.
So, okay, so what were his patients? What was sort of wrong with them, or what were they looking for?
Well, this is what really fascinated me, is that so he was based at a retreat center, and his patients seemed to be suffering from pretty much anything and all being treated. So he would have people suffering from addictions, depression, anxiety. I now believe that actually the root cause of many of these conditions can be thought of as trauma. Not so much psychosis. He wasn't treating what we would consider or we would call psychosis, but he seemed to be saying that he was having these incredible results. And I really trusted him. The way that he was talking, he didn't seem like he was lying at all. But he also was putting down the healing effects of ayahuasca to communication with spirits, with entities.
Yeah.
That the removal of energetic blockages was the thing that was actually causing the healing. And I found that fascinating as well. How could somebody be getting these extremely positive effects? And he wasn't denying that, DMT binds to serotonin receptors like most psychedelics do, which are the same receptors that antidepressants bind to. But he had a different focus. He was viewing the treatment through a different lens, from a different paradigm. And so that really fascinated me. And I ended up going with him down to Peru.
Oh, an adventure.
Yeah, it was an adventure. So I had my first experiences drinking ayahuasca with him. This was 2015.
And so in his retreat, were there Western people in the retreat center, or was it kind of local people?
So in retreat centers in general, the participants are almost always Western. So the whole concept of a retreat center, of going to a place for 2 weeks, taking a lot of ayahuasca and other medicines. It's not just ayahuasca, other plant medicines as well. So for example, you have medicinal saunas, you take purgative medications, topical medications on the skin and things like that. But the whole idea of doing that, and of course drinking ayahuasca every other day, is quite foreign to indigenous peoples. So somebody once described it to me as being the equivalent of an indigenous Peruvian person coming to London and going to a hospital and saying, this is great, I'm going to have an MRI, I'm going to have an X-ray, I'm going to take all the antibiotics, I'm going to take an enema. It's just, it would never, you would never really do that.
You certainly wouldn't want to, would you?
No, exactly. Yeah, you would get excited about doing it. You want to get your money's worth when you go to King's College London, for example.
Yeah.
So it's quite a foreign way of doing it for the local Peruvians. But it's normally, almost always is, an indigenous curandero who's leading the ceremonies. And they normally have some other indigenous people who are helping them as well. And then there's usually one or two Westerners who are also helping them too, either in ceremonies or outside of ceremonies. So it's a bit of a mix of people, but mainly Westerners who are there to receive those treatments.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. So I interrupt your story. So you went with him and had an ayahuasca experience. And was that like your first ayahuasca trip, as it were?
Yeah, that was my first experience with ayahuasca. And interestingly, like many people who drink ayahuasca, every time I drank ayahuasca, which was 6 times during this 2 weeks, I swore that...
Oh, that's a lot.
It was a lot. And I swore that it would be my last. Throughout every ceremony. I wrote about this in my PhD, that it's quite a common phenomenon that when people drink ayahuasca, they swear they're never doing this again until the morning afterwards, and the next ceremony comes and they think, okay, well, you know what? Let's go for it. Let's do it again.
Oh, wow. So it doesn't last, that aversion doesn't last very long.
No, it's, I think it's largely being in the experience can be so challenging, especially when you first start drinking ayahuasca and you're not used to it. And then afterwards, hopefully you begin to work through a lot of the things that you want to work through. And you also have a nice afterglow period. And so this normally lasts for about 48 hours to 2 weeks. especially the first 48 hours, you quite often feel amazing, which I think can be motivating to get back into the next ceremony. And then I came out of that retreat and I was just completely blown away by the positive effects that ayahuasca seemed to be having, both on myself and the other participants who I was in the retreat with. And so I started looking into the research that had previously been done into ayahuasca. And I assumed that there must be loads of research into ayahuasca. And there was some, but it was mainly Brazilian churches who combine ayahuasca with Christianity largely throughout Brazil. And there was relatively little scientific research into the naturalistic use of ayahuasca in the Amazon. There was a reasonable amount of anthropological research, but nothing really, or very little, that was psychological. And so I decided, along with a colleague and good friend of mine, Nigel Netzband, that it would be a good idea to start doing research into ayahuasca. We could design a study, we could apply for funding, and we could conduct this study.
So from your base in the UK, you could apply to the UK government for funding, I suppose?
Absolutely. We didn't get the funding. I think at that time as well, in 2015, it was more difficult to get funding. And we actually ended up self-funding that first study.
Wow, good for you. It is really hard to get funding. Simon, I have never had an MRC grant, government grant. It's just so hard. But for ayahuasca, I guess, pretty much unheard of, I would have thought. By people around or people judging these grants. I think it'd be very difficult.
We did actually end up getting an MRC grant for a study, which was really surprising. And we largely have Professor Celia Morgan to thank for that.
Oh, brilliant.
And she'd managed to get a grant to look at new and innovative ways of treating mental health problems. And we decided that ayahuasca would be a good thing to look at. So fortunately, over the years, we did start getting more funding. I ended up doing a PhD into Amazonian ayahuasca and mental health outcomes. And our research not-for-profit called ONAYA, which is actually Shipibo for doctor, and nicely also spells out ONAYA, as in on ayahuasca.
On ayahuasca. I didn't know that. That's lovely. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, really, really important to have that in there. And our not-for-profit just snowballed. We now work with about 10 researchers and universities all around the world, and it's my full-time job doing that, which is great and has been a really pleasant surprise and something that I honestly did not see coming.
No, and that's interesting. I guess you were really open and ready for it, but it all sort of came from that chance meeting with the shaman.
It did. It's amazing how much of my life has been influenced by that decision to speak to him. And I remember sitting in this cafe and thinking, I have no reason to speak to this man. I'd like to, though. There was something, he looked very interesting. There was something kind of drawing me to do that, an intuitive feeling. And in the end, I just thought, I'm just going to do it. I'll probably never see him again. And little did I know, he actually became my teacher, my maestro, the curandero. And 4 years after meeting him, I started training in Shipibo Curanderismo and Shipibo shamanism. And that really opened the lid on Pandora's box.
Simon, can you tell us a bit about that then? Because that's a very unusual experience that most of us won't have.
Absolutely. So Shipibo shamanism, to train in Curanderismo, is largely based around something called master plant dietas. And this involves going into isolation for prolonged periods of time.
So how long?
I mean, it can be anything from weeks to months. Indigenous curanderos do years. I haven't done years, but you go into isolation, you fast for prolonged periods of time, and you consume parts of specific plants. So you're drinking water that's had some plant in it, usually been left in the sun for a few days.
Oh, doesn't sound nice.
The whole thing is pretty grueling. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
And you're in ideally complete isolation.
In Peru or in the jungle.
Absolutely. So you're in something called a tambo, which is a small hut by itself, just in the jungle. Of course, you have lots of jungle friends there, so you have snakes, scorpions, tarantulas, rats, occasional hummingbirds who are with you. But yeah, ideally no other humans. And the process is designed for you to connect with the spirit of the plant that you're ingesting. Now, obviously, this is a completely different paradigm. And from the Shipibo point of view, from the Shipibo lens, the reason that you do this is to form a connection with the spirit of that plant. And when you do that, the plant has an influence. The spirit has an effect on you. It quite literally teaches you. And then when you go into ceremonies and you sing Shipibo in ceremonies, the role of the shaman, the role of the curandero, is actually a middleman. So when the shaman sings Shipibo, they're literally singing to their allies that they have made a connection with during a master plant dieta. And they're asking them to heal the participants in the room. That's what the singing is. It's a very long way of doing that. So all of the songs that you hear in Shipibo are completely freestyled. There's no set songs. It's basically like a really long poetic rap that goes on for about 6 hours. It's fascinating.
Wow.
It's absolutely fascinating.
It's incredible. So everybody will have their own experience. They'll have done the dieta, and then they'll have their own song or chanting or whoa! I didn't know that at all. That's amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. And you're right. You can really tell a lot about a person from the way that they sing. Just in general, you can tell a lot about someone from their voice when they speak, when they sing, but especially when they sing Shipibo, the way that they're singing, the way that they're communicating, you can really tell a lot about what they're doing and what they're trying to achieve with their healing in ceremonies.
Circles, thoughts going through my head. But now the image of you burning replaces love in my head. And sometimes I think your heart is made of lead. And sometimes I think we should break. Instead you try to hold me down, but you stabbed me in the back. So what to do, what to say? I knew you yesterday, but will I know today?
That's absolutely fascinating. So how long have you done this more than once? I'm guessing you have.
Yeah, so altogether, I've done about 4.5 months worth of these master plant dietas.
Incredible. And do people bring you some food? I mean, or what do you eat? I know you don't eat much.
No, not much. So you try and fast for as long as you can. And then you start eating normally 1 meal per day. And if you're being very strict, if you're being traditional, that would usually consist of rice, plantain, and if you're lucky, a very small amount of fish. And you just have that every single day. But it's really a test of willpower. And when you come out of those, you're a completely different person. And it is interesting because the Shipibo, from the Shipibo perspective, would say, that's the spirit. The spirit of the plant has now fused with you, fused with what they call your energetic body. But you've also trained yourself. It's very similar to a meditation retreat and very similar to Vipassana. And when you come out of it, you're definitely a very different, hopefully much improved person.
Fascinating.
It is.
Gosh. So what other Shipibo people like?
What are the Shipibo people like?
I mean, you must know them really well. You've spent a lot of time with them, and I know that you share learnings from sort of the Western way with the Shipibo people. Obviously, they're sharing with you. But, I've not met a Shipibo person. I kind of wondered what they're like. They're really good fun or quite serious?
They are definitely really good fun. They are, the best word that I can use to describe them is hilarious. But I think, like many people, I had this preconceived idea that when you meet a shaman, they were going to be like a saint. They were going to be enlightened in some way and never make any mistakes in life. That is definitely not the case. The Shipibo, they are fantastic with all of the dietas that they've done, all the work on themselves. They are solid, amazing people. But there's also a lot of problems within the Shipibo culture, and that's not as a result of the Shipibo per se. That's largely as a result of colonialism, or at least partly. And so the Shipibo peoples as a community are quite divided. When there was the rubber boom in the early 1900s, and the Spanish people came to Peru, and they broke up a lot of the indigenous communities, the Shipibo tribes. The Shipibo were almost wiped out, which is why it's so great to see them thriving again now. But it also meant that their community was quite divided. So although the Shipibo peoples themselves are fantastic, they're not without, it's not without its complexity.
Yeah. Well, they're human, and we're all
for
complex,
sure.
aren't we?
For sure,
we all have problems.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But I it sounds like they're great fun. I love that.
They are great fun. And one thing that I've just learned, I mean, I've learned so much from the Shipibo, which I'm eternally grateful for, but it's having the ability to laugh in almost any situation. And I've had numerous experiences in the jungle which have been probably the most challenging in my entire life. And I've been absolutely terrified. And they just come out to me, Simon, and slap me on the back. And that's it. After I, faced my own death and just, thought I was going to die. And I thought lost my mind. Simon, ayahuasca muy fuerte. Ayahuasca is very strong. Slap you on the back, get on with it, laugh it off, which is quite a skill.
Extraordinary people. And do they speak English then? How do you communicate?
No, so they speak Spanish. Yeah.
Oh, you're fluent Spanish. Okay. That's good to know, folks, actually, for our listeners. If you're thinking, not that anyone can just go out there and be with the Shipibo, but if this is something you're thinking about getting involved with, you need to talk to Simon first, and you need to learn Spanish. That's good. Actually, you've got some sort of common language. I mean, the whole ayahuasca experience is fascinating, but I'm fascinated by the purging. And, there are lots of other psychedelics that don't make you sick and give you diarrhea, and they seem to have a healing property as well. So what kind of is it then about the ayahuasca and the purging that's so important? Because that is a big part of it, I understand.
It's a huge part of it. I think the first thing to say is that the purging isn't just the vomiting and the diarrhea. So the way that the Shipibo describe the purge is a release of energy, and then and a release of negative energy. And that can come in many different forms. So that can be the vomiting, that can be the diarrhea. It can be crying. It could be wailing in ceremony, shivering, shaking, sweating, sneezing. A lot of people quite often sneeze or bursting into hysterics. All of these things are seen as a purge. But specifically, I mean, there are different ways that you can look at the purge. So you could look at it, ayahuasca has DMT in it, which is binding to serotonin receptors within the gut, and then that can lead to feelings of nausea and also to vomiting. That's one way of looking at why the purge is happening. But it's also extremely interesting in ceremonies. When you sit in a ceremony and the maestro, the curandero, raises the energy of the ceremony, and you can hear it and you can feel it because they suddenly increase the speed of the icaros, the medicinal chanting songs. They start really going in hard. Many people will purge all at the same time. It will be like a chorus of purging. Amazing. And so the curanderos say, yes, it's because we've increased the energy. So especially when you first start drinking ayahuasca, you quite often purge when there's a release of energy, according to the Shipibo. So I think this is one of the really beautiful things about ayahuasca is that you can always view it from different lenses. There will be a Western medical biological explanation, and there will also be a spiritual and a traditional medicine explanation that you can look at as well. And so it's really up to you to find which one resonates with you the most.
And most people I've talked to who've had a psychedelic experience, and sort of irrespective of what kind of psychedelic it is, talk about it being a spiritual experience. That seems to be kind of a common, and mystical. Is the mystical experience really important for the healing process?
I mean, that's an interesting question. I personally feel that it's fundamental.
Okay.
I think that it's okay. Let me phrase it like this. So I've spoken to Don Rono Lopez, who is the maestro that I apprentice under, based in the jungle, a lot about the Western way of using psychedelics versus the indigenous way of using psychedelics. And so in the indigenous use of psychedelics, there's a huge emphasis that's put on the spiritual component. And in the Western way of using psychedelics, it's not that there isn't an emphasis that's put on the spiritual side of things, but it's different. It seems to almost come as a bit of a byproduct. And I find it quite interesting that the Western people right now, Western scientists, seem to be quite rightly completely focused on safety and efficacy with the use of psychedelics. And so for them, that means having a fully qualified psychiatrist or trained psychotherapist within the room to make sure that the patient is safe during the experience. For the Shipibo, they just want to have a fully qualified shaman to work with spirits, people who know how to move the energy and to work with the energy. And so when I was speaking to Rono about having a psychologist or a psychiatrist with somebody when they're taking psychedelics who's not trained in shamanism, he was horrified. It was like, you won't have a curandero, you won't have a shaman? That's incredibly dangerous. And so the example that he gave is that it's like going to an airport and then going into, to the back to the runway where all of the airplanes are, and you just get on an airplane, you don't know where it's going. In his perspective, you go to another dimension, and you just open a door and it could be anything. It could be a demon, it could be an angel, you could have a good experience or a bad experience. But funnily enough, Western scientists are saying the exact same thing, but the opposite thing. If you're not a psychiatrist or a fully trained psychotherapist, then that's ridiculous. You couldn't possibly work with psychedelics because you have to have people who know what they're doing. And so they seem to be saying equal and opposite things. And I think there's also a difference in perception of spirituality. So in my experience of working in psychedelic trials within the West, we do lean into the mystical experience. We do try to provide some kind of a spiritual context for the experience. But that's usually, in my experience, having a small statue of Ganesh who's kind of out of place within the dosing room. And it's a bit tick boxy, and it's definitely not what the indigenous curanderos are referring to when they talk about a spiritual experience.
Well, what's really got really interesting there, as well as answering the question, is talking about the difference between what happens, in a trial in the West or a kind of psychedelic experience and, what happens in indigenous practice. And I guess my question is for you is how difficult that is to come back from having done all the, you're very much involved in the indigenous practice. I guess you're learning to be a shaman and coming back to the West then and kind of slotting back into Western medicine, NHS, Western medicine, running a trial on psilocybin in, for example, Imperial College, exactly where there is no shaman. Should we have shamans in our trials? And it's complicated enough, I know, to get a trial up and running, let alone get FDA approval, as we've seen with the tragedy about MDMA recently. But is that something you think could work?
So I fully believe that the way forward and the way to make the greatest amount of progress right now is to respectfully learn from different ways of understanding the world and from different ways of understanding the universe. And I was at a conference this weekend and somebody asked me, why do you do all that research in the jungle? Like, why did you choose to do it in the jungle? Which is a very valid question. And I was reflecting on it. And the reason that I do that is because in my experience, the most impressive cutting edge technology that I've come across is with the Shipibo in the jungle. The technology that they use, in my experience, is completely unparalleled. But that's not to say that it's necessarily better or worse than Western ways of doing things as well. I think it's easy to glorify and put on a pedestal Western science or indigenous knowledge. But I think when we work together, that's when we could really, really make significant progress. And there are.
But are the Shipibo, they're very welcoming, aren't they? And they work in retreats. Are they keen to work with a Western way?
So for the Shipibo specifically, the most important thing I've found when it comes to working with indigenous peoples is to fully communicate and to form a connection. And what we're seeing now is that not just the Shipibo, but a lot of indigenous elders. And there was somebody at the most recent MAPS conference, an indigenous elder from Brazil, who got up and said on stage, and this has been the same message from many indigenous people over the years, saying, it's great that you, the West, are finally coming round to our sacred plants, but don't leave us out of the conversation. We know how to work with these plants. They're sacred to us. We've been working with them for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And the way that you're working with them is at best disrespectful, and at worst, it can be dangerous. And different indigenous people are saying different things, obviously. But there seems to be a running theme with a lot of indigenous people that if you ignore the spirit of a plant, that could have detrimental effects. So what does this translate to in modern day research? And again, if we're thinking about incorporating indigenous viewpoints into research, first of all, we have to have open dialogue with indigenous peoples. And that doesn't mean just putting them on a panel and listening to them like once a year and then ignoring everything they say after that. It means really working with them to develop culturally safe protocols. And then, but what does that look like? I think it can look, there's a spectrum of what that could look like. It could be as simple as incorporating things such as setting an intention, which most psychedelic trials do, giving gratitude to the earth, doing a little ceremony, all the way up to behaving and experiencing the plant as a spirit. For me personally, I feel that a really great way forward would be to have therapeutic dyads that include one indigenous person trained in shamanism and one psychologist or psychiatrist, because then you really have the best of both worlds. And I'm pleased to say that we're getting closer to that. So there are some trials in Australia right now that have just started welcoming indigenous therapists into the research, which is really, really great. They're not shamans, but we're making headway in that area. So it's yet to be seen how this will unfold.
Absolutely. That makes perfect sense to me, somebody who understands the plant spirits. And I just think that would be a much more holistic experience, But so for ayahuasca and plants that grow in the Amazon, what about psilocybin that is, grows here and kind of is indigenous here? Where would you find a shaman for that kind of plant?
This is an excellent question. And this is one of the reasons that I was so drawn to the Shipibo and working in the Amazon rainforest, is because they have an intact lineage that you can easily learn from.
Yeah.
Whereas with psilocybin, there are some lineages. There are some people who know how to do that, for example, in Mexico. But for the most part, especially in the UK, we've lost a lot of that knowledge. And that's largely because of the witch hunts and then prohibition and things like that. So it's also quite an exciting time for psychedelic research, because in many ways, we're creating a new tradition from scratch. But again, I was having a discussion with an Indigenous Australian who you actually know, Jem Stone. And we were talking about we were talking about whether it's right to say, indigenous people, because obviously that could be a Shipibo from Peru, that could be an indigenous Australian, and a million other people all around the world. And she said, obviously we can't tar everyone together with the same brush, but there are common denominators in indigenous worldview. And I've definitely found that with working with the Shipibo and then working with indigenous Australians. And so I think having some kind of indigenous representation, even if it's not directly related to psilocybin, would be a really good way to start.
Yes, I see what you're saying. That's really, really interesting, isn't it? Fascinating. So what about pharma getting involved with developing psychedelic assisted therapy? That's happening. It's been happening for quite a while. How do we kind of manage that? There will be profits. Do we have a reciprocity agreement with Indigenous people, giving back if you're going to make a lot of money? Patenting, all the sort of Western approach to developing a medicine, that kind of seems at odds with, the kind of the proper use of these plants.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, firstly, I'm not against medicalization. I think that reciprocity is absolutely key. And so the same principles still apply. Communicate with Indigenous peoples, listen to them, take what they say seriously, work together in partnership, give back where we can. All of those things are really important. But I think there's also a reality that if you just say, oh, we shouldn't be medicalizing psychedelics, well, I mean, it's too late for that. That's already happening.
It's happened, yeah.
So I don't see much point in just saying that shouldn't be happening. Plus, I think it's really important to think about accessibility. There are, for many people, going to a hospital and receiving some synthetic psilocybin from a doctor in a lab coat will make them feel much more comfortable and potentially even help them more than going to the Amazon basin and drinking ayahuasca.
Sure.
But
most people can't afford to get there.
That is also true. Or have the time off work. Yeah. All of these things are issues. But that being said, I do think that when we take the psychedelic out of its ceremonial setting, and again, it's interesting because it's different for synthesized psilocybin, but the ceremonial setting just seems to provide so much of the healing. The Shipibo say that the healing comes from the Icaros, from the medicinal chants. And in fact, it's not actually essential for the participants to drink ayahuasca in the jungle. The curandero can drink the ayahuasca, which allows them to see the issues that are in the participant. And then they sing the Icaros to the participant to heal them. The participant doesn't actually have to drink ayahuasca. That became more common in recent years because Westerners wanted the psychedelic experience. But traditionally, it would only be the curandero who would do it.
Oh,
which is fascinating, isn't it? It's a completely different way of thinking about healing. And so when we're thinking about the medicalization and the Western use of psychedelics, my feeling is that, it will probably be of some benefit. But I also feel if you start treating these substances, these chemicals, like just serotonin agonists, they're going to start behaving like just serotonin agonists, which is, the mainstay of antidepressants that we have. And we're beginning to see that in our psychedelic trials. We're beginning to see that psychedelics are performing as well as escitalopram, for example, which is one of the best SSRIs that we have. I just feel like we're really missing a trick. And the mainstay of the healing, whatever that may be, if we're not working with Indigenous peoples. And that's before we start getting into disrespecting the plants and issues that can come through greed and through profit as well.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. So, a lot needs to happen in the West. We need a kind of legalized system here so that people can access, on the NHS without paying, without having to go a long way. But it also needs to be done in absolutely the right context. And I think you're absolutely right. We need to have the curandero and, the dyad, as you talked about, the sort of therapeutic dyad, and somehow a more of a sort of retreat scenario rather than going to the lab and understanding. I guess people need to understand the plants a lot more and where they've come from.
I think that's a really simple first step. It would be to just spend time with the plant, and there's the origin of the psychedelic. And if you can't do that, just spending time in nature, which now a lot of psychedelic trials actually do encourage you to do. But we have an Indigenous advisory board, and that's one of the things that they've been advising when I've been involved in lab-based research as well. Just get to know the land that you're taking the psychedelic on. Treat the psychedelic as sacred. Set your intentions. Give an offering. These things are really simple and can be a good way into beginning to incorporate Indigenous knowledge into the psychedelic research we do in the West.
And I think it's about educating people who are going to engage in taking a psychedelic or a therapy, really encouraging them to engage much more deeply with all the proper processes and indigenous practice, and just learning about that before you engage with the psychedelic.
Absolutely. 100%.
It's really, really interesting. I'm just thinking about my neighbor who's very keen on psilocybin and the mushrooms, and he will only really be in nature, be on a mountain or by the sea when he's, and it's quite infrequent that he uses them, but it's a lovely way that he's really respectful.
One interesting thing is that throughout all of the ayahuasca traditions that I'm aware of in South America, when ayahuasca is prepared, when it's brewed, one of the most important things that you can do is to sing to it and to set good intentions to it. And so this is a huge process. In the Santa Daime, which is one of the churches that combines Christianity with ayahuasca, the process takes days, and there are specific hymns that they sing, and they're singing for hours and hours and hours. The ayahuasca is not left alone. The Shipibo, in my experience, some of them do that really well. I have to admit, I have seen some Shipibo just texting at the same time when they're doing the pot. So it's not everyone, but
I'm sure.
Traditionally you're supposed to put your positive intentions into the brew when it's made. But it's an interesting concept, because if we then look at the way that drugs are manufactured, especially if original plant material was freeze dried, so the water's removed. For indigenous people, a lot of the energy, the spirit of the plant is in the water. And if you're removing that, then you're removing the spirit. And again, if we're developing pharmahuasca, which is the chemical constituents of ayahuasca, that doesn't make you purge, we're removing a huge part of the spiritual process. So we're really breaking it down to its basic chemicals and stripping away a lot of the parts that indigenous people think of as essential to the healing, which is something that's worth considering.
Yeah, absolutely. And pharma companies, developing third generation psychedelics that don't have a psychedelic, effect. They don't, have that altered state of consciousness, is quite an interesting concept as well.
It's an interesting concept.
It really is. So we just have to, So I know you've done, it's fascinating, quite a lot of research in retreat centers in the Amazon with, organizations like Heroic Hearts. Do you want to tell, we haven't got all that much longer. This has been so fascinating. If you would like to tell us a little bit about that, maybe the traumatic brain injury work that you're doing.
For sure. So we're currently working with a fantastic organization called Heroic Hearts, who send military veterans with PTSD to the Amazon rainforest to be treated with ayahuasca. And so we've been doing research with them over the last year. And so we're looking at psychometrics associated with PTSD, and then also looking at the impact on electrical activity in the brain with EEGs before and after participants go on retreats. We're also looking at epigenetic change, which is the impact that the environment has on the expression of genes. And it's becoming more and more accepted that epigenetic changes may be passed down through generations. So we're looking specifically to see whether ayahuasca and the whole retreat experience may be able to change the expression of genes that have been specifically dysregulated as a result of war. And then we're also collecting samples of stool as well to look at changes in the gut microbiome.
Oh, microbiome?
Yes, for the microbiome. And so this study is ongoing at the moment. It's actually continuing over the next 5 years. But at the moment, the results have been incredible, actually. So we've had 40 veterans go through that we've got all of their data from. And of the 40, 100% no longer meet the threshold on our measures for a diagnosis of PTSD. And they all had to.
Extraordinary, Simon. Nothing's going to do that.
Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary. And that's immediately after the retreat and maintained 6 months later. So I do have to caveat that this research isn't published yet. And also there are 5 participants that didn't get back to us. So we're not entirely sure what happened there. But still, 40 participants, 100% of the responses, it's unheard of. Just absolutely unheard of.
Yeah, Absolutely. Yeah. You could only dream of seeing, you'll never see data like that in a clinical trial.
No. And this is the question, is what's causing that effect? And so all of this research that we're doing is naturalistic, it's observational, it's in the jungle. It's not like lab-based studies where we're controlling for everything apart from the drug. But do you want to control for everything apart from the drug? Could the healing not be the Icaros being in the jungle, the ceremonial container? Could that be the active drug that we're missing in Western clinical research? And that's what I'm most
sure
interested
it is in our lives.
In our lives, exactly. In our lives. Yeah.
And I think from the veterans I've talked to, the camaraderie and meeting, having an experience, such a profound experience with people who've been through very similar war trauma experiences. That must be. But I read your work about the connectedness to nature, that the longer people are in the jungle, the higher the scores are without necessarily having any more ayahuasca experiences. That's very interesting, I think.
It absolutely is. In my own personal experience, just being in the jungle, not drinking ayahuasca, you immediately begin to feel better. And in our very first study that we did, which was looking at the effects of ayahuasca on personality, we actually dubbed this the Mallorca effect, which was heading to the jungle and just being in that environment may well be having a positive effect. And I'm sure it does.
Pretty brave thing, I think, to do this, as a traumatized, well, as anybody really, going all that way, putting your trust in, you put your trust in, in the shaman, somebody you didn't know very well. That was pretty brave, I think.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the reasons why, in my opinion, if you're working in that world, if you're working in not just the biopsychosocial domain, but really having the spiritual, the indigenous take on spiritual, you need to be trained more so than medical doctors. This is what I feel, because people are so vulnerable when they're in that psychedelic space. And this is one of the issues of the retreat centers, is that there just isn't that regulation. And so you do end up with people experiencing all kinds of abuse, such as emotional, physical, sexual, financial, all of these different kinds of abuse. But then how could you possibly regulate the use of ayahuasca or retreat centers? Who would regulate that? Who decides what's okay? How do you decide whether a shaman is qualified enough? Is it the amount of dietas they've done? Is it the contact with spirits? Who's going to regulate that? So it's difficult. And working in the Amazon, going to the retreat centers, you just have to be so careful, because it can be the Wild West out there.
Oh, can it? I didn't know that. That's interesting. What you mean with bad actors just opening up a retreat, having money and opening up a center? Yeah, I talk to quite a lot of people who want to go on a retreat, and it's a minefield for them. You don't really know. If you don't know the field and the people, it's very, very difficult. I always tell them to come and talk to you. Or somebody else.
That's why I've been getting so many emails. Got it.
Yeah, sorry about that. But it is because there's so much more sort of media out there, and lots of celebrities have, kind of had the experience, the healing experience, and people, which is good, see this as a really brilliant, positive experience for them. So many people have all kinds of trauma. But it is a complete minefield.
For sure. It has spread to the point that you can not only find your retreats on TripAdvisor, but the last time that I was flying to the jungle, on the magazine that they have in front of the chair in front of you on the airplane, you could flick through at different ayahuasca retreats that were available. So it has well and truly entered the mainstream now.
That's scary stuff, Simon. Really, that's extraordinary. Oh my God. I think it is very difficult for people. And then it costs a lot of money, and you are so vulnerable. I'd far rather be there and meet somebody like you met your shaman. somebody that you got to know and you instinctively trusted. That's lovely. So he is now your teacher.
Yes, yeah, he became my teacher, which is awesome.
Absolutely awesome. I just think that's such a fantastic story. So we're pretty much out of time, sadly, because I think there's an awful lot to cover with this. And you are one of the, real expert with your experience of, living in the jungle and doing the dieta and having, it's a long time you've been doing this now. Would it be 5-6 years?
It's actually 10 years.
Oh, 10 years, you see.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a lot out of your career.
Absolutely. It's 10 years of working with ayahuasca and doing the research, and 5 years of training in Curanderos.
And I mean, this is a really stupid question, I think, but when will you ever be kind of fully qualified?
This is another thing, and it's not a stupid question at all. It's a really valid question. Is that how do you tell when somebody is qualified? So when I finished medical school, overnight somebody just gave me a certificate. I passed my exams. Here you go. You're a doctor now. And then you take exams as you go, and you can see where you are. You can say, oh, I'm a junior doctor or I'm a consultant psychiatrist. But in the jungle, you don't have that. You only have the amount of time that you've been training and word of mouth. And so the way that it works in the jungle is largely through word of mouth. You have these people who have a fantastic reputation. You have other people who don't go to that person, they're bad news. And so this is the issue with Westerners. So when you get off the plane in Iquitos, you suddenly get swarmed by people saying, I run an ayahuasca retreat center. You should come with me. And you can't necessarily blame people for seeing, or you can understand how that happens when you have indigenous people who live in poverty and then they see white people coming with loads of money and don't have an idea. And for many of them, they're looking for the trip. They're looking for the fireworks. I've heard many Shipibo say that the visions can be distracting. It can be distracting from the actual experience of ayahuasca. Don Rono says, if you have too many visions, what you get is illusions. You won't see truth. You'll become confused. But for the Westerners, they're looking for the trip. And so indigenous peoples understand if you just get a psychedelic, of which there are many in the Amazon rainforest, doesn't have to be ayahuasca, that's going to make them trip really hard, they'll probably think, oh, that was really good ayahuasca. And so you end up in these kind of situations where you do have indigenous peoples who are offering things that might not be ayahuasca. And again, I wrote about this in my thesis. There have been a bunch of deaths that have been put down to ayahuasca. But actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, every single one of them usually isn't ayahuasca. It can be a different plant that can be toxic.
Yeah.
Or they've been mixed with other plants that they shouldn't be. So, for example, cannabis, largely a bad idea. Or the person wasn't screened properly and they had some kind of condition like psychosis that's generally a contraindication to psychedelics like ayahuasca.
It's very sad about psychosis, I think, because I worked on this for a long time. I mean, I was looking for better treatments for psychosis, for long-term schizophrenia. I mean, yeah, other people developing them, but we were testing them. And the treatments are pretty debilitating, and it's a very debilitating disorder. So it's very sad, I think, that that's real contraindication. And there's, there doesn't seem to be a sort of psychedelic that can help people who've got such a severe illness, really.
Well, it's a contraindication to ayahuasca, but not to the rest of the not to the rest of the hospital that the Amazon rainforest is. And I'm not by any means suggesting that people go to the jungle in order to find treatments for psychosis. The first thing to say is that the perception of psychosis in the Amazon is very, very different. It's thought of as being different to what we think of as psychosis. But that being said, I have seen shamans treat things that look like psychosis with other plants, sometimes having incredible effects. I think this is something to bear in mind, that ayahuasca, people think that it's just ayahuasca, that's the main treatment. And that is a really important treatment. But that is just one part of the treatment. And there's, hundreds of thousands of other treatments and other plants many of which we don't even know about, many of which in the West we don't even have a name for, which are also used as part of the traditional medicine repertoire.
And actually, Simon, many that haven't really been discovered yet.
No, absolutely not.
The Amazons.
And it's such a shame when we think about the deforestation and the amount of knowledge that's lost. Things that we aren't even aware of gets lost. And for what? For beef. It's ridiculous.
It's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking what we're losing. And swathes of it every day. Not to mention the animals, all the species that we will lose. Yeah, that's a whole other podcast, isn't it?
Oh, yeah. Absolutely horrendous. Absolutely horrendous.
But absolutely heartbreaking. Dreadful. Absolutely dreadful. But I guess we should kind of end on such a positive note about the amazing power of the indigenous practices. And that the plant medicine is important, but there's so many other aspects of the process and the practice, and people sort of sharing, or the knowledge being passed from generation to generation. I really love that. I think that's fantastic. So for our listeners, are there any books, who really want to learn more about this? Are there any books that you, or sort of resources that you could recommend to them, and we'll put them in the show notes, that would take them a bit deeper into their understanding of Indigenous practice, maybe?
Absolutely. I think a really good starting place, a book that I read years ago, was about the only other medical doctor that I know who's trained in Shipibo Curanderismo, who is Dr. Joe Tafur. And he wrote a book called The Fellowship of the River about his journey into this world, and then trying to marry the two worlds together, very much like mine, but without the research side of things. So that would be a really great starting place. And he has a really good way of explaining things from both a Western and a traditional viewpoint. And then, of course, there's always our websites as well, which would be brilliant if you wanted to check them out. So you can go to onnaya.io and onnaya.science are our two websites. And then you can find us as well on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.
Actually, I highly recommend the Onnaya website.
Oh, great.
Full of great information. That's lovely, Simon. Wow. And we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. I'm impressed. Yeah.
So am I. It's never usually so straightforward. Lovely. Thank you so much, Simon, for joining us today.
Always such a pleasure, Joe. Looking forward to the next time.
Will I know today? And sometimes I think your heart is made of lead, and sometimes I think we should break instead. You try to hold me down, but you stab me in the back. So what to do, what to say? I knew you yesterday, but will I know today?